Hi, my name is Joseph Hilley, and this is my informative speech. What I'd like to talk about today is the civil rights injustice and police brutality in the United States. I can remember as a young man growing up in the United States thinking that it was the land of opportunity and you could do whatever you set your mind to as long as you work hard. Now, this isn't true for everyone, unfortunately. Racism across the country has really suppressed a lot of the citizens here. Racism in this country has caused outright suppressions of its citizens, and this racism wasn't just between private citizens, but it also included our government and police agencies. As our citizens continue to feel unheard and misrepresented, our society is even more fractured than before. Our current government leaders are not even capable of trying to solve the issue. As a matter of fact, they're trying to find new ways to break laws to suppress it. Now, how will we as a multiracial country begin to resolve the cancer of racism that has plagued us since the beginning of our existence? So what I'd like to talk about was the beginning of our civil rights movement. Emmett Till was largely considered to be the beginning of our civil rights movement. And Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy that was beaten and murdered because he was allegedly flirting with a white lady at a store. And he was found at the Tallahassee River. Now, why this was considered to be the beginning of the civil rights movement is that his mother insisted on his casket being an open casket so that everyone could see what they had done. Unfortunately, there were no convictions in this case, but it did capture national-wide attention. Another case of this was the Freedom Summer Project, where 3 young men belonged to a voting agency that was trying to spur African American participation. Now, they were sent down to Mississippi to help out with the African American culture or society to try to encourage them to vote, but they came up missing. Now, this agency enlisted the FBI to try to help find them, and what they found were that the local police agency and the mayor were involved in the disappearance and murder. Another leader of this era was Malcolm X. He was a religious leader, a civil rights activist, and he demanded equal rights for African Americans. Malcolm X insisted on education and also that African Americans were to be treated on an equal playing field with whites. So he would often say that if you come up and commit violence against African Americans, it's only logical that they fight back to defend themselves. So he meant this. He said it by any means necessary. Martin Luther King was another activist during this period, and he was a civil rights activist, a religious leader, and an advocate for voting rights for African Americans. Now, what Martin Luther King believed in was nonviolence, and he felt that this was a stronger message to the nation. And also what he insisted upon was that educating the African American society and spending money in black-owned businesses to make the whites feel the loss of their money. Now, again, what played a bigger role throughout this movement was the behavior of the police. They became very militarized during this time. Now, when did this militarization of police begin? It was during the 1897, the Posse Commitments Act. And what this did is it borrowed federal troops from enforcing state law. But it did not apply to the National Guard because they were a state agency. They were often deployed to help keep the peace. Now, this wasn't always true though, because in the case of 1994, the Pullman strike, there were 12,000 troops deployed to try to break up a workers' strike at a railroad station. And there were several people were injured and also killed. Another instance of this was the Little Rock, Arkansas, during 1957. A lot of National Guard's troops were deployed to try to help keep the peace when the schools were forced into integration. There were several riots during this period, and Lyndon B. Johnson signed into one act, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. And what this did is it made available a lot of grants to local police agencies so that they could purchase military-style equipment and arms. Now, I felt this was a huge mistake because at this point, when there were so many movements going across the country, he could have reached out to the American people to find out what it is that they felt misrepresented for, but instead he stood on the grounds of law and order, which drove the military, the police force into a military role. There were also the war on drugs. So as drug problems in the U.S. grew, this drove police agencies further into a military role. But unfortunately, a lot of where the drug problems were the inner cities, where a lot of the minorities and African American communities were. During 1996, the Supreme Court voted in favor of forfeiting civil rights. This also gave local police departments the ability to purchase even more military equipment directly from the Pentagon. Also in post 9/11, with the creation of Department of Homeland Security and such laws as the Patriot Act, this turned a lot of our police forces into agents with the war on terror. So now we have police agencies, again, with more modern military-style weapons and equipment, and also they are being trained in military tactics. So instead of looking at our U.S. citizens as that, they were looking at them as potential terrorists. So, the unproportionate cases of police brutality against African Americans. Now, what I wanted to start with was our U.S. Supreme Courts don't even recognize the difference between lethal force and non-lethal force. And this was evident in the cases of Tennessee versus Gardner in 1985, Graham versus Conner in 1989, and Scott versus Harris in 2007. The U.S. common law frameworks regulating the use of force by law enforcement officials, as laid down by the Supreme Court, does not comply with international standard required under the United Nations basic principles of the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials. So how can we be the big brother of the world trying to enforce human rights when we can't even do it here at home? So how do our people view the police? There was a study of 40,000 U.S. citizens across the country, and what they found was white Americans thought that 46% of the time our police force was using too much force. Our Native Americans came in at 54%, Hispanic Americans came in at 58%, Asian Americans came in at 60%, and African Americans came in at an astounding 80%. Now what this means is, as far as the disparity, or if you want to think of it in other terms, 1 out of every 11 African Americans think that the police force is doing just fine. Statistically speaking, black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than whites. White people are actually 1.3 times are likely to be armed than black people. And black people are 6 times more likely to be killed in Oklahoma than in Georgia. Now, looking at our police agencies across the United States, 8 out of the largest police agencies, or 8 out of 100 largest police agencies across the U.S. are disproportionately clearly black Americans. And these police agencies are Reno, Nevada, Oklahoma City, Santa Ana, California, Anaheim, California, St. Louis, Missouri, Scottsdale, Arizona, Hallelujah, Florida, and Madison, Wisconsin. Another study was composed in looking at emergency 911 calls. In 1.2 million calls taken by the 911 emergency calls in the U.S., they were plotted in the use of force involving guns in neighborhoods. And they also did that according to racial compositions. And what they found is that white officers were more likely to use their firearms than black officers. And also that white officers were 5 times more likely to use their firearms in a predominantly black neighborhood. Not to mention the number of racially motivated calls to the police that were proved to be of a nonviolent nature, or in the fact of to hide what was naturally going on. Now, I feel for this country to begin the healing process of systemic racism, we must first begin to change the way that we view the role of the police agencies, but also to hold police officers that break the law accountable for their actions. The single biggest complaint of African Americans communities is that they feel there is no justice for the loss of their loved ones at the hands of the police. This imbalance of justice contributes to how society views African American communities as well. We need to change the laws, both federally and locally, that they regulate how the police agencies are being used and how they engage the public. Now, what I believe is that through equal justice begins equal opportunity. And with equal opportunity, our country can begin the healing process through diversity. And my name is Joseph Philly, and I thank you for your time.